Hi, I'm Becopin, and this is 36 Years, where we talk about Philippine politics, news, and democracy. On May 9, the Philippines elected Ferdinand Marcos Jr. as president. He is the second Marcos to hold the post. The first, his father, the dictator, was ousted from power on February 25, 1986, in the People Power Revolution. That was 36 years ago. Here we try to answer the question, where is Philippine democracy heading 36 years after the revolution? Welcome to 36 Years, available on Rappler social media pages and on wherever you listen to podcasts. First, a quick overview of ongoing news events this week and key events from the week prior. The transition process from the Duterte to the upcoming Marcos administration continues. President-elect Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has told his incoming budget chief, Amena Pangandaman, to make sure his programs are in the 2023 budget, which the 19th Congress will deliberate on and later approve. If you don't know, his allies are set to head both chambers in Congress. His cousin, Representative Martin Romualdez, is set to become Speaker of the House, while Senator Mig Zubiri, who was part of the UD team slate, is set to be Senate President. Anyway, focus areas include agriculture and food security, climate change adaptation, economic recovery, improved healthcare and education, enhanced infrastructure projects, including digital infrastructure, billion, utilization of renewable energy sources, strengthen tourism and jobs creation, sustainable development. This is more or less what was in his platforms in the 2022 campaign, which was released via video with weeks to go in the 2022 campaign period. More cabinet picks are being announced. Check out Rappler's story page for the latest updates on the transition of power, bukod sa appointments, and dun din yung updates sa inauguration, sa upcoming inauguration ni President-elect Marcos. In the news last week, a name we have not heard in a while and a name many younger viewers and listeners may not be familiar with, June Lozada, the whistleblower in the NBN-ZTE deal, surrendered to the National Bureau of Investigation after the Supreme Court upheld the verdict in a graft case filed against himself and his brother. Here's context for you from ABS-CBN's Nico Bawa. In Senate hearings held from 2007 to 2008, that is 15 years ago, Lozada alleged that officials of the Gloria Macapagal Arroyo administration tried to earn millions from the NBN-ZTE deal. This was supposed to improve communications between government agencies. Following the expose, the deal was scrapped. Cases were filed against Arroyo, then COMELEC Chief Benjamin Abalos, and other officials, but they have since been acquitted. Lozada was ordered jail for a different case, awarding his brother leasehold rights over 6.5 hectares of public land while he headed the Philippine Forest Corporation. Lozada faces jail time between 6 to 10 years. Former President Arroyo, meanwhile, was re-elected to her post as 2nd District Pampanga representative. Benjamin Abalos was just re-elected as Mandaluyong City Mayor. That's a post he held almost 2 decades ago. And his son, Ben-Hur, is the incoming DILG chief of President-elect Bongbong Marcos. Those are the headlines. Our first episode for 36 Years picks up from a conversation we had on Election Day, which took place almost a month ago to this day. Leloy Claudio is an assistant professor under the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies of UC Berkeley and has written books on Philippine history, liberalism, but more importantly on Election Day, as over 31 million Filipinos here in the Philippines at least cast their vote for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. It was Leloy who reminded us, referring to the intensity of disinformation in the Philippines, that it will get worse before it gets better. Thank you for joining us, Leloy. May ikaka-worse pa ba to sa lagay na to?
Thank you, Bea. Well, it can get worse kasi hindi natin alam talaga kung ano yung gagawin ni Ferdinand Marcos Jr. In terms of cabinet appointments. A lot of the cabinet appointments seem like they're normal cabinet appointments, lalo na din sa economic bloc. Pero yung kanyang Justice Secretary has already started threatening the media. So that's one area where I think it could get absolutely worse.
Yeah. And he already made pronouncements also opening the possibility of Chacha under Bongbong Marcos. Okay, so the last time we saw each other, you had a glass of red wine in hand. Bongbong Marcos was not yet president-elect. Bumoboto pa lang, kakabukas lang actually ng polls when you dialed in the last time. Ang dami na nangyari. He's been proclaimed by Congress. Inauguration plans are in place. the National Museum, where the legislature used to be housed. We can talk about that later, the irony of his chosen venue. But how have you been personally since then?
Well, as I told you, during election day, I had already steeled myself for the result. Actually, I had steeled myself for the result maybe mga 3 weeks before the election day. So I've been ready for it. But ever since, it's become a kind of roller coaster ride for me. So, for example, when I heard the incoming Justice Secretary threaten the media and say that the media should strengthen the nation state and not tear it down, which means effectively saying the media should not threaten the nation state. So incoming Secretary Remulla is saying that the media cannot criticize. And he even said something very specific. He said, why does the media call the incoming president a son of a dictator? So he's kind of already warning the media, these are no-go, this is no-go territory. And then next interview naman niya, he says something like, we should review the Dilima case. So medyo nakampante ako. So bago-bago eh. So until manumpa siya at makita talaga natin what Marcos Jr. governance looks like, I think it's going to be a roller coaster ride for me and a lot of Filipinos who are concerned about the future.
Yeah. The funny thing, well, I don't want to say it's funny, but like as someone who also covered his campaign, like for a big chunk of the campaign, parang it was also a guessing game. Kasi like I said, his platform wasn't really expressed thoroughly up until the weeks leading up to election day, and hindi nga thorough, parang video clips lang eh. Like he didn't actually have like a printed out manifesto for everyone to scrutinize and everyone to pick apart or ask questions, as if he lets us ask questions for the most part din naman.
I'm sorry about that. Ano ba yung kating-kating mong itanong, ikaw personally?
Ako, I think I focused more on his platform, especially when he released the videos, right? Like he had very grand promises, grand but vague. Parang kunwari, when you say you want to prioritize agriculture, ano ibig sabihin nito? Tsaka I think yung isa nga, parang siguro gustong itanong din ng mga tao about his promises or about his platform was, saan mo ba kukunin yung pera na to, given the economy that he'll be inheriting, right, after Duterte exits office. And I think current finance chief kind of laid it out when he presented to media yung parang proposals nila for the incoming finance secretary.
Well, I think there's really going to be a difference in terms of yung finance secretary. Very subtle, pero nakita ko na to when Diokno was in the central bank and when Dominguez was in finance. Yung interview sila sa Bloomberg, iba yung sinasabi nila eh. Sa tanong ng Bloomberg kay Dominguez, are you concerned about the debt? He'd say yes. Tatanong kay Diokno, well, your counterpart finance secretary is saying that the debt is a problem. And then he would fudge. He'd say, actually, maybe he didn't really say that. He was really concerned about growth, ganyan. And now it's become very clear that actually he disagrees with Dominguez. He doesn't think the debt is such a big issue. He thinks we should get back to 6 to 7% growth, and then that will take care of everything. I actually agree. I mean, I'm consistent naman here. I like big spending. I like lots of debt. That's always been my position. And so I kind of agree with Diokno over Dominguez, and I think that's a good sign. Because we should really get into the headline. No? Ang sama pakinggan, 11 trillion pesos, 60% GDP ratio. But we have to think about that comparatively. 60% to 70% debt to GDP ratio still places us in the bottom half globally in terms of debt to GDP ratio. And hindi nangahulugan mataas yung debt to GDP ratio, mahirap yung bansa. In fact, Japan is the most indebted country in the world at 250% debt to GDP ratio. So I think, the way forward for Marcos critics like myself is to not deny that they have good ideas. Like I think Ben actually has good ideas. And I heard someone I disagree with vehemently thinking Pinoy defending Ben Diokno. And I actually agreed with him, even though our politics are completely different. But that's one way to, I think, bridge these particular gaps, to make certain concessions na minsan may tama kayo.
Yeah. And I guess siguro quirk din yun ng Philippines, no, where values don't necessarily coincide with policy. But we can talk about that later on. Gusto ko muna mag-zoom out and mag-look back ng kaunti. Dito sa, I think the big question in a lot of people's minds, how did we get here? Si incoming Secretary Remulla nga said na bakit ba laging son of the dictator. Well, I mean, that's a fact. And it's
Okay.
also an editorial call to point that out, especially when you talk about the context of why he was elected, how he was elected, the backdrop of Bongbong's election into power, 36 years na after. So, Lelo, nagbasa ako nung something that you wrote back in 2010 alongside Romel Kuraming. Am I pronouncing that
Oh,
correctly?
yes. Oh.
Okay, I'm
That's
gonna
my
read
first ever academic piece.
Are you
So medyo
serious?
medyo hilaw na hilaw pa ako dyan.
Okay, but I'm gonna read a few lines, ha. So intro pa lang to. The extent to which the EDSA revolt may be considered as a critical juncture thus depends significantly on the assessment of and meanings attached to the Marcos years. Conversely, the way in which images of Marcos era evolve will be greatly influenced by the changes in how the public views EDSA. Does it annoy you that you were right? Does it annoy you that you predicted the 2022 elections in a way?
Well, hindi ko na predict because actually during that time I was also doing field work in Hacienda Luisita. So sa Hacienda Luisita, doon ko unang narinig yung word na dilawan.
Oh.
And it was
This
used
was what?
in the way
This was in
2009, 2010. So this was the first time na narinig ko yung word the dilawan used pejoratively because these were activist farmers who were opposing the Noynoy Aquino and the Cojuangco family. So ginagamit nila yung word na dilawan. But at that time, my conclusion was, this is a narrative that is a kind of ground-based narrative, but that it is an exceptional narrative. I thought the society was actually defined by the yellow narrative. And nung time na yon, malinaw pa rin kung sino yung kakampi ng taong bayan at sino yung kalaban ng taong bayan. And since then, of course, that nagbago yun lahat. So what I didn't realize, what was brewing in Hacienda Luisita, that would be nationalized in the span of 10 years.
Yeah. How was it nationalized, do you think?
Well, interesting, nung time na nasa Hacienda Luisita ako, trinotroll ako noon. Actually, ang unang mga trolls ko were yellow trolls. So trinotroll ako ng mga yellow troll because I was writing against, what I felt was really unfair and unjust governance in Hacienda Luisita. So I was being trolled by my future comrades in the Dilawan movement. I say that in jest, of course. Tapos nung time na yun, napansin ko the people who were kind of echoing my position in terms of the critique of Hacienda Luisita was this YouTube called Pinoy Monkey Pride. Naalala mo yun, Bea? I think that was the first kind of pro-Marcos YouTube account. Pero yung YouTube account na yun, it wasn't yet talking about why Ferdinand Marcos was great. It was just talking about Hacienda Luisita, the problem with the yellow narrative. And nung una, I was very sympathetic to it kasi yun din yung nakikita ko sa Hacienda Luisita. And then, of course, lumaki yun, mas naging confident yun. Kaya nagbago talaga yung lahat. But of course, if you wanna ask me the question, when did it start? When did this road start? I mean, I can say actually as early as 1965. Kasi the myth-making surrounding Marcos started during that election.
Yeah. I-research ko to mamaya si Pinoy Monkey
Pride. Yeah.
Monkey. What a colorful username. Syempre parang in the decade that has been, parang dumadami na itong. But that's interesting that you pointed out. So this account started first, kumbaga, calling out the Dilaw narrative or the yellow narrative.
Calling out the Dilaw narrative and pointing out gaps in the Dilaw narrative. Including things like, for example, sabi ng Dilaw, sinungaling si Ferdinand Marcos dahil sinasabi niya nagko-conspire si Ninoy Aquino with the communists. And then sasabi ni Pinoy Monkey Pride and other similar YouTube at that time na actually may evidence naman talaga na nagko-conspire si Aquino with the communists. And during that time, I was looking at State Department files, and the State Department of the United States itself, in its classified files, said that Aquino was conspiring with the communists. And then I asked a couple of high-profile communists at that time, and they said Aquino was conspiring with the communists. So during this time, actually, hindi mo siya masasabing fake news. Some of it was, of course. But during this time, it's like poking holes. And there were so many holes that were being poked that actually a lot of students were asking me about the narrative circulating dito sa social media na to. Kaya ang sinasabi ko is like when you look at Marcosian social media, the lens of fake news is not adequate. You can use it, of course, because there's a lot of fake news there, but it's not adequate. You have to look at other factors that lead to the emergence of a strong pro-Marcos social media movement.
Yeah. alam mo, the past weeks and actually years siguro, no, parang I look back when I was much younger. When I say much younger, as in hindi pa ako journalist, and I used to look at the world and politics especially, parang black and white, di ba? Ito masama, ito okay. Pero I guess after covering politics, you realize that the good guys aren't always good. Ang daming questionable na decisions, ang daming weird policies. But when you deep dive into it, it makes sense why politician A or B voted that way or pushed for this legislation. I wonder, parang did that feed into where we are now? This tendency, and I think it's human nature, I guess, din, no, na to distill things into good, bad, black, white.
Yeah, and not to assume that your interlocutor or the person you're debating with is acting in good faith.
Yeah.
I think yun yung pinaka-importante. So, yung favorite example ko dyan, yung Taliano Gold, for example. Somebody comes up to you and says, ibabalik ni Marcos yung Taliano Gold. Your natural instinct is to go, tanga yan.
Yeah.
But actually, behind yung tanga narrative is a genuine desire. And what's the desire there? It's a desire for prosperity and dignity for our country, diba? Kasi kung binalik yung Taliano Gold, yayaman tayo ulit. So there are two versions of that in the pro-Marcos camp. The quote-unquote tanga version, which is bibigyan tayo ng Taliano Gold, and the quote-unquote smart version, which is yung sabi ni Sandro Marcos, the Marcoses will revive the East Asian developmental state in the Philippines. Right? They're two very different messages, but at its core, these two messages are tapping into the same desire, meaning we want to be wealthy, right?
Yeah.
And I can understand that, diba? Kung mahirap yung taong bayan, gusto mong yumaman.
Yeah. And I mean, tama nga. Parang ultimately, people want security. People want a promise of a better state that they are in. And I mean, that was one of the main, albeit vague promises, diba, of the golden years or parang the past great years. Which, I mean, again, parang kumbaga sa Marcos campaign, medyo fill in the blank siya. May allusions to the first Marcos presidency, the martial law era. Pero ayaw niya sabihin hindi niya sinasabi. If anything, the Senate bets say it explicitly, but you will never hear it from Marcos himself. Say for a few policies, I think. Parang sa energy, I think, or was it on yeah.
Meron mga elements of Marcosianism ka makita, kind of vestigial elements of old Marcosianism.
Yeah.
Like for example, ipapaaral ko kung viable pa ba ang Bataan nuclear power plant.
Yeah.
I am more comfortable with debt. He said something to that extent.
Yeah.
I don't like privatization, right? He said that, or I'm very wary of selling government assets. I think this was as a response to Sonny Dominguez, who actually wants to sell government assets. So itong kind of heavy hand of the state in the economy, it's obviously a vestige of what he learned from his father. And I think he might have indeed learned something from his father. Another telling sign is yung first press ko niya, and he was talking about inflation. And he said inflation is a function of the fact na mataas ang presyo ng langis, ng oil, ng crudo. Sabi niya, I've actually had experience negotiating with other countries on this. So I immediately thought parang 2012, 2010, did he become an envoy? No, sabi niya, during the last oil crisis in 1973, I was sent by my father to Saudi Arabia. Di syempre Google ka agad ako. He was a teenager.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's so telling because this guy can implement Marcosian policies because he was learning under his father. And one of the reasons why he seems so entitled is because he was groomed like a prince, right? I mean, who else gets educated in the art of governance, practicum in the art of governance at the age of like 16, 17? Only princes, right? So the guy's a prince and thinks about himself as a prince.
Yeah. And I mean, he's packaged that way, although hindi naman, sometimes literally though, if you look at the TikToks or the viral quick short videos about the family, parang sometimes it's explicit, sometimes parang implied, and of course kasama na dun sa Sandro Marcos, who yun nga, interesting din yun kay Sandro na parang pasundot-sundot, nagpo-flex din siya ng mga kunwari policy pronouncements. Sandro of course is an incoming freshman legislator pa lang. He'll be representing Ilocos Norte in the 19th Congress.
Parinya sa Natalia.
Yes,
I mean,
he defeated Ria.
Actually, very important, di ba? Because now, ang norte mo, ang Ilocos Norte mo, is solid Marcos na, di ba?
Yeah.
And this is, I think, the first time naging solid Marcos siya dahil hindi lang naman
Yeah.
sila dating political dynasty dyan, di ba?
Yeah.
Nakakatakot ang Ilocos politics because you have the dominance of the Marcoses in the north and then 15 Singsons ata ang nanalo sa sur. I mean, this was a horrible, we tend to talk about the national politics, pero ang sama din ng local politics, you know, Kakabagaw, Dinagat Islands, talo sa Ecleo, di ba? The MILF, they were supposed to have a good showing dahil they were able to negotiate the BARM. Ginulpi sila sa Mindanao sa BARM. So it was not a good election.
Yeah. Parang people tend to, obviously because it's the national elections, tend to focus on the nationalization of these dynasties. Munti kan tayo magka four pairs of relatives in the Senate, although former Vice President Binay didn't make it. So, tatlo lang.
Yeah.
yun na yung konsuelo. Konsuelo sa atin, tatlo lang.
Pero sa akin nga, hindi pa konsuelo yun because I should have voted for Vice President. I didn't, pero nagsisi ako, I should have voted for him because at least Vice President Binay has a history as an anti-Marcos activist. Kids these days forget it, right? But he was a human rights lawyer defending victims of Marcos human rights violations. So that's part of the Binay DNA, regardless of what happened after.
Yeah, and he didn't really flip-flop hard in terms of talking about the Marcoses, no? Although we did see his daughter, the incumbent Senator Nancy Binay, join Miguel Zubiri, who is ang weird na pati Senate President may presumptive na rin, no? Pero na-negotiate na kasi more or less, tapos na yan na ano. Actually, gusto ko lang bumalik dun sa itong technique nila, no? Kasi parang na-realize ko lang din in the past, or like I was thinking about it during the campaign, but I think I cleansed my thoughts ngayon lang in the aftermath na parang while the unity or the Marcos message draws on nostalgia, di ba? Itong pati yung shirt jack, pati yung buhok, yung victory, peace sign, obviously, tapos may vague mentions of old glory days. Yung main message kasi talaga nila is looking forward, babangon muli. When you ask politicians why they supported Marcos despite personal history in some cases of oppression during martial law, they'll always tell you na because you want to look forward, we can't dwell on the past, etc., etc. Kasi syempre, 'di ba, if you look, if Marcos Jr. Talked at length about the martial law years or the years of his father, that would open him up to examination of the past. Pero paano nangyari yun? Paano niya nasabay? na 'di ba, na pupulot ako kung saan convenient sa elements ng martial law at ng the greatness of the Marcoses, of the Marcos myth. Pero ayoko pag-usapan yung martial law itself.
Ang galing, no? I think what you were referring to kanina, yun yung sagot. He's almost like through vagueness, he becomes a Rorschach test. Alam mo yung Rorschach test, di ba? You plop a couple of, you plop ink dots, kasi interpret mo whatever way you want, and that's reflective more of you than what the person is actually saying. So bahala na, he's an empty canvas for that. And unity is a kind of perfect empty canvas also. Babangon tayo muli is a kind of perfect empty canvas. So hasang-hasa yung kampanya. Alam talaga niya kung ano yung gagawin niya.
And if you're the opposition, like paano mo titirahin yung unity? Like ayaw mo ng unity. Diba parang ganun yung naging narrative tuloy. Na parang, ayaw mo ba ng pagkakaisa? Anong klaseng, I mean, that was what they, what a lot of their allies said in response to the opposition movement.
Kasi unity naman talaga, unity ng elite families na natatakot sa return ng quote-unquote dilawan. And the reason why natakot sila is because the last time merong dilawan doon, pinakulong si Arroyo, right? And they're afraid that can happen again. They're afraid na makulong si Digong. They're afraid na mag-crackdown ulit dun sa mga ginagawa nila. And that's why you have families that ostensibly should not like each other. I mean, we should really look at the coalition. People forget that GMA is a Macapagal, and Macapagal was the rival of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. in the 65 election. In that coalition was also Erap Estrada. I mean, Erap Estrada has been a Marcos supporter for the longest time. Actually, he's been consistent on that front. Pero of course, kaaway niya si Arroyo nung EDSA 2. So, meron talagang, and then Villars, kaaway naman ng Villars si Erap, di ba? Kasi si Villar ang nag-impeach kay Erap, tapos nandun din sila dun sa coalition na yun. The greatest rent seekers, I call them the greatest rent seekers in the history of the Philippines, di ba? So, how do you fight a coalition like that? in the span of a few months. I mean, nag-declare si Vice President Robredo, tama ba, October, November, ganyan. So kung ang lalabanan mo is the biggest political juggernaut I've seen, at least since I've observed Philippine politics, and I can go back in history. I'm trying to go back in history and trying to think of a more formidable political juggernaut. Wala pa akong naisip. I could be wrong. Wala pa akong naisip. Pero how do you do that in the span of a few months? So if you want to beat them, you have to start now, and you can't, of course, return to yung mga lines from the past. Like one line that I think has stopped working is anti-corruption. A lot of people say na, ay nakalimutan ba ng mga tao na si Marcos ay corrupt? Actually, hindi nila nakalimutan. What's the evidence for this? Si Najib, parallel example, si Najib sa Malaysia, it looks like he's going to be prime minister again, and he was convicted in one of the biggest corruption scandals, the 1MDB scandal in Malaysia. That scandal was in 2018. So it's not about forgetting. It's about people accepting that politicians are corrupt, and that despite the corruption, you can rely on them for other things, right? And whatever those other things are, what those other things are, Rorschach na ngayon.
Yeah, someone pointed out to me during the campaign that tama nga, harping on anti-corruption doesn't matter anymore because it's not the hot button topic for voters. Kasi, well, primarily kasi also surveys indicated that yung main concern ng voters coming into 2022 was really the economy and jobs. How they don't see that in relation to corruption, I'm not sure. I don't think they have may studies na that actually check that. Yun din yung isa kong naisip during the Marcos campaign, na parang while it's yung tawagan ni Lian Buwan, who was the main reporter who covered Bongbong Marcos. It's a campaign that ran on good vibes. Di ba? Umagang kay ganda, papasok siya, wave, may Philippine flag sa tabi niya. But in a way, it tapped into the cynicism of Filipinos, I think. The whole notion na pare-pareho lang naman lahat, magnanakaw lahat. Ito na lang. I don't know why.
Kasi bago, maiba naman. Kasi magnanakaw naman sila lahat, parang gano'n.
Paano siya bago, Leloy, though?
Bago for them. Diba? Kasi sobrang tagal na. Interesting nga yung idea. Pero interesting thing, yung idea ng anti-corruption is like, of course, I'm against corruption. Pero in a way, that's not an idea. So again, you can get on your kind of liberal high horse and say, these people are so stupid, they accept corruption and they think na hindi tayo maghihirap kung corrupt yung mga tao. But if you look at the academic literature, China is one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And yet it's a lot richer than us. It's posting some of the most amazing GDP growth rates in the world. Korea, before it became rich, was one of the most corrupt countries in the world. If you look at the World Bank studies of Korea in the 1940s, they were calling Korea a bottomless pit of corruption. And according to the economist Ha Jun-chang, who's an economist of the development of Korea, nauna yung economic growth sa Korea bago malinis yung corruption. So you cannot dismiss those ideas. Why is it actually, so baliktad siya. Kung mabawasan ang hindi walang corrupt, walang mahirap. Kung mabawasan ang hirap, nababawasan ang corrupt. Because in a richer economy, the stakes are higher.
Yeah.
And it's simple, like you can pay your bureaucrats a bit more. Simple things like that. Same thing with the United States. The United States was super corrupt at the turn of the 20th century, and then bumaba yung corruption as tumaas yung economic growth. So you can't actually dismiss these people as dumb. They have a point. Maybe they don't know the academic literature. But it's not true. For me, it's not true na kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap. It's just a false statement.
Yeah. Am I wrong in thinking na nag-lesson na? I don't know, baka kasi because my perspective was very different in that I was chasing around politicians in the Uniteam Alliance the whole 90 days of the elections. But to me, nag-lesson na yung discourse on bobotante or variations of that. But do you think, or are we still stuck in that mind na, ay nako, pinili mo si X, si ganyan-ganyan, bobo ka?
Yeah, meron pa rin ako naririnig, and I'm very sensitive to that kasi one, it's undiplomatic language.
Yeah.
But actually that doesn't mean that we cannot condemn voters. Ito naman, I think, yung problema ng mga ibang tao. Takot na takot silang matawag na elitista, that they're afraid to condemn voters. So I'm not ready yet to condemn certain people who support Bongbong Marcos, but I am ready to condemn a lot of people who continued supporting Duterte knowing full well na ang daming patay sa drug war. So for example, di ba, the majority of Filipino people believe that the drug war was a good thing, and yet the majority of Filipino people also believe that extrajudicial killings were happening. So that means the majority of Filipino people are okay with extrajudicial killings. Hindi ko tatawagin bobotante yon, pero sasabihin ko na immoral yon. I'm going to be very clear that a society that believes that has a rot in it, right? There's a result, may cancer sa lipunan. So hindi ko sinasabing bobo. Maybe I'm saying something worse. Morally complicit, maybe that's actually worse.
Yeah, actually, now that you mentioned that, diba, Ronald Holmes on the day after elections, he pointed out that martial law to the current population remains divisive, but tumataas na daw yung may mga tao na may positive impression. More or less 1/3 may positive impression, one-third negative impression, and then 1/3 undecided. So hindi sila sure kung maayos ba ang martial law, specifically referring to martial law under Ferdinand Marcos. So imagine, di ba, parang an era where dissenters were killed, jailed, arrested with little to no impression, and now 36 years after he was ousted into power, according to a survey, 1/3 lang yung may negative impression.
Pero actually, hindi yan ganun kaluma, hindi yan ganun kabago kasi I was looking at an SWS survey from 1986.
Yeah.
Effectively, yung attitudes na yun, you can say that that survey reflects yung baseline attitudes for democratization because it's directly after the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos. 60%, 60+% of respondents called Ferdinand Marcos a brave president. 30+% of respondents refused to believe na magnanakaw siya, even in 1986. So 30+% na yun, di ba? Ilang percent yung nakuha ni Bongbong Marcos, right? Hindi siya ganong kalayo eh. This threat has always been there. And na-point out nga ni Manolo Quezon, I think Manolo was the first one to point this out. Kung kinumbay mo yung boto ni Danding at saka ni Imelda nung 92 election, edi meron ka ng Marcos restoration, ganun palang kaaga. So we really shouldn't be surprised. I mean, this has been a part of our society for a very long time.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people also became semi-complacent because of the 2016 elections na natalo si Bongbong, not realizing that it's not so much na he lost, but he almost won. Like he was so close to winning the vice presidency. And the more I look at the numbers, it was Alan Peter Cayetano in a way who prevented a Marcos vice president in 2016.
Dahil yung Mindanao votes hinati niya nung panahon.
Hinatak niya yung Duterte votes. Actually, now that I think about it, the 2016 vote, as early as 2016, the Duterte vote was also kind of the Marcos vote already. Andun lang si Alan Peter Cayetano, nakipaghati siya sa vote na yun. Ngayon, na-consolidate in 2022 because you have Sara as he now calls her his BFF.
Talaga? Kung ako rin, tatawagin ko siyang BFF because he basically gave him the election. I mean, you can say Sara gave him the election, or you can say GMA gave him the election because she brokered the deal, right? So it's the irony, ang Makapagal giving an election to a Marcos. I wonder what their parents must be thinking.
I think a lot of ancestors who lived through the martial law era would have been rolling around in their graves because of what a lot of their descendants. Kasi ang dami actually, kung iscan mo yung yung regions, ang daming incumbents whose fathers, uncles, older siblings, iba nga sa kanila sila mismo eh, parang naka-experience rin sila ng paghihirap under martial law. And yet they're allies with Bongbong Marcos now. Nabanggit mo nga kanina na 1986 pa lang, di ba? Parang it was already there. Like, hindi na slowly na transform yung perception of the older Marcos, but it was always there na hindi, like, a huge shock of the population liked him. Take us back, Lalo, to 1986. Hindi ko sinasabing andun ka na, hindi ko sinasabing adult ka na at nakikirali ka na sa people power. But because you obviously study this, no? Kasi, okay, syempre, my view of martial law is based on what was taught to me, and in a way also, no, parang through a millennial's eyes, a millennial journalist's eyes, so based also on what the politicians who I cover have been saying, what people I talk to have been saying. But how was it viewed by the people who live through the moment.
The word I really use is relief.
Okay.
Because I remember when I was working on my first book, yung Taming People's Power, that was a kind of anti-Dilawan book kasi I was working in Hacienda Luisita. So yung galit ko sa Dilawan, I poured it out there. And I said, after 86, ano ba nangyari na restore lang yung mga oligarchs? It was a very angry book written by a very angry young man. I'm no longer as angry. And then I was talking to my mom about it. And then she said, the problem with the cynicism of this book is that you weren't there to feel the relief. So, I mean, yeah, there were a lot of problematic things that happened afterwards. Pero after Marcos, nakahinga talaga kami. And I mean, it's very real for my parents kasi under threat sila for assassination. Communist, we say it explicitly now. They were members of the Maoist Communist Party. They could have been killed under Marcos. And it for a while, in the 80s, it wasn't safe for them. But by the time the 90s hit, it was a lot safer for them na. Even though, it's always dangerous to be a communist in the Philippines. So yung ganun ka explicit moment of relief, or, people being able to write again, the newspapers emerging, citizens being able to read writers like Nick Joaquin again. I mean, that would have been, that's a wonderful experience. And the most important thing that EDSA did, and this is according to the political scientist Mark Thompson, is because of EDSA, we've had regular elections. I mean, we shouldn't take that for granted, but before EDSA, walang regular elections na may semblance of fairness. So the moment we hit 92 and Cory Aquino turned over power, sabi ni Professor Thompson, we were outside the endangered species list of democracy. And I'd like to think that because we had a regular election, even though we elected someone dictatorial yung premise ng campaign, we still elected him under an EDSA system, that we are still not in the endangered species list of democracy, right? And that's where I'm still somewhat hopeful. Of course, the irony here is that you have a Marcos being an EDSA president with all that entails.
So, asan tayo ngayon? Of least concern ba tayo sa listahan ng binabantayan ng state of democracy?
Well, iba na yung bare minimum lang naman kasing elections, 'di ba? In terms of democracy. So I think we hit that bare minimum, but over that pahirapan na ang usapan, 'di ba? Syempre, anong gagawin sa media? And that's very important because the media is the lifeblood of democracy, right? So if I don't pray, but if I were a prayerful person, I would pray for people like you every night, because I mean, these are you guys are the ones who will keep this democracy alive as we move forward.
Tumawa lang ako, medyo nervous na tawa yun. One of the things that I always think about as a journalist, and just like as a normal Filipino, parang did we romanticize people power?
Oh yeah, I mean, we did romanticize people power. Medyo at saka binaduy natin yung narrative, 'di ba? After EDSA, puro never again, never forget those who don't wish. Ano yan? Parang hindi ko na nga alam yung quote dahil I've heard it so many times. Those who want to repeat history, whatever yung santayan na sama-sawa na o rinding-rinding, binaduy natin. Meanwhile, yung mga Marcos, nagsimula yung snazzy YouTube videos. They've always been one step ahead, di ba? We're pontificating in our books. We're saying words like never again. Meanwhile, they're doing snazzy YouTube videos. We're pontificating again in our books, saying never again. Nasa Facebook na sila. And then, next thing you know, naunahan tayo sa TikTok, right? So yeah, we romanticized it, tapos binaduy pa natin. And then, of course, because sumabit yung EDSA narrative, nobody likes it anymore, or fewer people like it anymore. The institutions that are associated with the EDSA narrative, people don't trust them anymore. So for example, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church cannot disidentify with the EDSA narrative. Why? Because they built a freaking church on the site, di ba? Yung Our Lady of EDSA. Hindi mo pwedeng i-deny na dilawang ka, naglagay ka ng simbahan dun, di ba? So because they're so articulated with the EDSA narrative, now those people who don't like the EDSA narrative don't like the Catholic Church either, and that places them in a very difficult position because yung political influence nila has really been curbed as a result of this kind of insurrection from the authoritarian forces.
And of course, the Liberal Party na. I hope none of my Liberal Party sources and friends will hate me for this. But in a way, EDSA people power turned into a marketing strategy also. Is that too harsh to say?
I mean, na-commercialize, di ba? Naalala
Yeah.
mo yung mga Ninoy and Cory, mga relo, t-shirt,
Yeah.
ganyan. So na-commercialize siya and it became identified with a particular elite lifestyle. And
Yeah.
in 2010, of course, you're riding high. You don't think that's problematic or you don't think that's going to cause trouble. Nasa huli yung pagsisisi, of course. And that's why I don't think your Liberal Party friends will blame you because sino ba naman ang nakakita nung panahon na yun na may problema doon, di ba?
Yeah. No, of course, because you're when you're winning, literally, when you're in power, it's hard to see the weeds growing kung medyo nasa patio ka pa or nasa balkonahe ka na. Hindi mo makikita na may namumuo na pala dyan sa lupa na pagsisisihan mo rin eventually. Another thing that we want to talk about, history education, or at least the gaps and lacks thereof. Naging hot topic siya recently, at least especially during the elections din, dahil sa PBB, yung nag-quiz sila at hindi alam na mga bata kung ano ang kumkursa. You study, you teach, you research on history. Does the fact that we have history, like, yung title ng Rappler in-depth report on this is History in Crisis. Does it surprise you that this is happening? And how are you processing this now?
Ang dami. I think yung isang original sin dyan, of course, yung dinicentralize yung production of textbooks early on. So ang dami-daming pumasok na fringe ideas through the textbooks. The other thing, Manolo points this out also all the time. Second time I'm referencing Manolo. Because he's been so helpful in terms of the way I understand this, is like marami naman talagang Filipinos na hindi dumadaan sa history. Hindi lang dahil wala yung history, kundi ang taas ng dropout rate, di ba?
Yeah.
So one way to address the history problem is to reduce the dropout rate so that they hit the history classes. Another thing is, of course, yung even if the history classes are there, they're taught in an uncritical fashion. I've been writing textbooks, and ang demand lagi sa amin ng teachers, sa mga textbook writers, is lists. Bakit lists? Kasi a list is an easy PowerPoint slide and an easy test, di ba? Andun na yung PowerPoint slide, tapos papamemorize mo yung list. But I like prose, and I think history should be conducted in critical prose, but they like lists. So what's the problem with lists? You create a list about Ferdinand Marcos. There's no critical appraisal of it. Yung list, let's imagine a textbook list about Ferdinand Marcos, elected in 1965. Re-elected in 1969, assumed office in 1970 again, right? Ano pa ba yung mga nandun? Declared martial law in 1972. Kung ilista mo lang yung major events si Ferdinand Marcos, you say, okay, there's no problem with Ferdinand Marcos. Right? So we really need to challenge our educators also to move away from lists and memorization.
Yeah, kumbaga sa journalism, hindi lang dapat masaya sa straight news. Kailangan wag tayo matakot sa analysis at sa in-depth report. Why are we so afraid of that though? Or why is there that notion na nako, wag na, parang bukod sa fact na yun nga, madali siyang gawing true or false siguro sa mga exams.
Yun. Pero actually hindi ko i-dismiss yun kasi yung burden naman talaga lalo ng public school teachers sa atin, dahil tinuturuan. Kaya yun yung gusto nila. Kaya gusto nila straight up. So hindi na sila magtatrabaho pa. But really, I think it's also part of yung kind of deferential culture. Meron tayong deferential culture, di ba? We defer to our elders, and so we don't challenge things as much. And you see this, I think Professor June Aguilar had an article in Rappler na sinasabi niya, the power of the Marcos narrative is that it's able to portray those who are outside the unity narrative as quote-unquote pasaway. Di ba? So kung pasaway ka, panggulo ka. But instead of viewing these people as pasaway, you should view them as actually integral facets of our democracy. Importante ang pasaway sa demokrasya, but the way we structure our language is authoritarian na kagad. Masama maging pasaway.
Oo nga naman. Kasi, but, okay, the liberal movement, small letter, hindi yung liberal party, kasi baka isipin ng mga tao when we say liberal, LP ka agad. The LP, by the way, I think is just starting to get its bearings again. Hopefully, it won't take as long as it did in 2016. How should you respond to this?
Well, interesting yung provocation ni Professor Randy David, get rid of the Liberal Party, start a new party. Kasi hindi mo na may iwasan, may tape na yung partido na yon. So, okay lang yun sa akin because liberalism naman continues to reinvent itself, di ba? the line I keep using, I've been using it since Duterte got elected, is a line from Rizal which says, liberalism is a plant that never dies. So laging may resurrection. It will appear as another plant, and it may not appear under the guise of a liberal party. It could appear in the guise, say, of a grassroots movement, a new party like a social democratic party. Ewan ko, pero bumabalik naman yan eh. So for example, 1872, there was a movement called La Juventud Escolar Liberal, the first liberal party in UST. Membro dun si Pasiano Mercado, who would eventually become Pasiano Rizal, Kuya ni Rizal. And then yung main party nun was Comité Reformadores, which is also a liberal party. That was suppressed in 1872 after the Cavite Mutiny, alongside the killing of Gomburza, of course. And then halos walang makapagsalitang liberal sa Pilipinas for 10-15 years. And then that movement has to reconstitute itself in Madrid and Barcelona as the expatriate movement under Rizal and Co. Right? So it takes 10 years. So laging may moments of violent suppression, and then may moments of reemergence. And so if we look at that pattern, then maybe it's hope, and there's hope. And remember, it does rhyme, because the suppression of liberalism was 1872. What happens 100 years later? Another massive suppression of liberalism, 1972, the declaration of martial law.
Yeah. I have a question though, because I know like a lot of people right now, it's been a month, more than halos, since May 9, na-proclaim na, nilalatag na ang inauguration. Marami pa rin, kung hindi sila lugmok, may ibang tao hindi pa rin natatanggap yung results of the elections, may ibang lugmok. You seem very optimistic. Hindi pala. Pero hindi ka lugmok, hindi ka nawawalan ng pag-asa. Where does that stem from though?
I have to admit, Bea, it's from my privilege. I mean, I'm in the United States. Meron akong escape valve intellectually, emotionally, physically. Although, given the number of times I check the news, parang wala rin sometimes. But, it helps. And then the other thing is, of course, itong sense of proportion, itong sense of history na weather lang yan nga, sabi ni Erap. So magkakaroon din ng na magbabago yung tide, and we'll see a new generation of leaders. I'm just sad because my parents, they're old na, and I just want the change in the dynamic of Philippine politics to happen before they die, because I don't want them to pass away sad about the republic, a republic that they fought for when they were young, and that they seem to have lost again now that they're senior citizens. So it's them I'm really, they're the ones I'm concerned for. In terms of the Filipino youth, like nieces, for example, I think there's a decent future ahead for them. It's yung mga patatanda na lumaban na kay Marcos once, tapos palalabahanin mo pa ulit na naka-wheelchair na yung iba nga, di ba, dinadala dun sa rally na nakahiga na, and they're literally nakahiga na sa deathbed. But they're the ones I cry for. They're the ones I really cry for.
Honestly, one of the first times na naiyak ako siguro in the kasi there's not really time to cry when you're in the middle of covering a campaign, because your bigger concern is how do I fly out and what time, how many hours do I have to sleep. Pero when Glenda Gloria wrote about how her generation is losing sleep over the at that point, leading the surveys pa lang si Bongbong Marcos Jr. They're losing sleep over the fact na, kumbaga, parang to them, this is our failure. I think, but I think millennials will also say na, oh, we also failed. Collective failure, yung feeling siguro ngayon.
Yeah, collective failure, but also there are many things out of our control, right? This is it should be emphasized that this is a global movement.
Yeah.
The disillusionment with liberal democracy is happening everywhere, and that's no accident. It's because they're helping each other. These people run the same networks, diba? I mean, you did great reporting. Rappler did great reporting on Cambridge Analytica. We know that the people who designed the Marcos campaign in '86 were the same people who designed the Trump campaign in 2016. We know that Rodrigo Duterte loves Vladimir Putin, for example. We know that Bongbong Marcos likes China. To what extent is he supported by China? We don't know, but it's a kind of global movement. And just because hindi natin makita lahat ng connection, because a lot of these connections it's skullduggery, di ba? doesn't necessarily mean wala siya, and we can actually scratch the surface. Like yung reporting niyo, of course, on Cambridge Analytica was scratching that surface, and hopefully the picture becomes clearer as we move forward. Because if the picture becomes clearer, kung makita natin yung extent, malalaman natin kung paano ba talaga labanan yung problema.
Yeah. Speaking of yung weather nga, kung tingnan mo nga, di ba, ito nga Unity Team Coalition, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo is a power broker once again. Like, it's not like this was out of like unexpected, di ba? Syempre, under Duterte pa lang, naging House Speaker na siya. Kita mo the Estrada siblings are back after a very painful for them 2019 loss. So mabilis umikot ang Philippine politics for better or worse.
Saka brittle naman yung coalition na yan, di ba? Kita mo na nga yung cleavages pala ngayon. Nagparamdam si former President Arroyo na okay lang naman kahit hindi siya naging Speaker of the House, pero nasaktan siya, di ba? Telling yun, di ba? Yung maglilikan ng gano'n. Or yung sinampal si Sara Duterte publicly. Di ba? You want defense? Here you go. Education, one of the toughest jobs for a Marcos administration. So those cleavages are there, and I don't know if this is one of my sources of hope. In Philippine politics, masyadong maraming gahaman na kailangan pakainit at hindi mo kayang pakainin lahat. So at one point, gumuguho yung mga coalition ng mga gahaman.
Yeah. Actually, yun nga yung interesting for a political geek siguro to look at how this very powerful but medyo fragile coalition, yun nga, will ito pa lang, forming the cabinet pa lang, di ba? Parang it's taking so long. And it gives you the impression that intense negotiations are happening behind the scenes. Because you have powerful lobbies siguro left and right, up and down sa mga key positions. As we're recording this, just to siguro, in case by the time this airs, may bago ng announcement. It's June 4. Wala pang DOH na ina-announce. Wala pang DND na ina-announce. So like the major, not to diminish the other cabinet posts, pero parang the anchor na cabinet positions wala pang napipili. And I think it says a lot din na
and this could still change, pero ngayon sa June 4, pag tinitignan ko yung cabinet, what's surprising about it is parang mas maraming ERA people kaysa sa GMA people, which is not something I expected, di ba? Parang of course, they're drawing from previous administrations, and the assumption was that they would draw from GMA. Actually, a lot of the people, Diokno, for example, they're ERA people.
Yeah. Well, they did have promises na pati daw magiging true unity coalition, and they'll be taking from different camps. Siyempre, hindi nila sinabi at the time na they'll be taking a lot from the ERA camp pala. Now we're seeing that. But it'll be interesting. Actually, yung mas interested din ako, so we have the cabinet level, the secretary levels, right? I want to see who they will be appointing to the USECs, to the ASECs. Yun din, lobbying din yun from the different camps. Kasi baka one camp will say, sige, you can get the secretary, but we get the USEC for this specific division or this specific concern, or i-imbentohan ng USEC position ng isang tao nila. So, interesting yung
DFA ba meron ng chismis?
As of recording, wala pang napipili. May mga names floated pero they haven't selected. Yung pinakamalinaw talaga, in fairness, from the very very beginning was the House leadership. Si Martin Romualdez na I love saying this out loud kasi sobrang interconnected ni Martin Romualdez sa lahat. Bukod sa cousin siya ni Bongbong Marcos, campaign manager siya ni Sara Duterte, and he's also the Lakas CMD president. Right. So it's interesting to see how Congress will shape up, the 19th Congress will shape up under Speaker Romualdez, while Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo is one of his constituents in colleagues in the House. So
at kaibigang matalik daw. Let's see. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're ending this in a bit, but kasi I watched a few of your Basaganang Clip episodes, and I have to say, feeling ko nga parang that should be like bukod sa show na yon, like that should be like in a way how people should view things. Like I feel like there's also this human nature naman siguro yun na parang you just listen to what you want to hear. I guess part din yun ng grieving process after the May 9 elections. Pero I think you mentioned in passing in jest nung May 9 na parang you felt you were too harsh in criticizing the people power driven.
I didn't mention that in jest actually. So
Really?
yung first book ko was called Taming People's Power, and hindi to plug actually, medyo sinisiraan ko nga ng konting libro. It's a critique of the EDSA narrative. Nung time na yun, wala pa naman Duterte, walang Marcos, so I thought it was safe to critique the EDSA narrative because it was the dominant narrative. And then we reissued it nung mga 3 years ago, and then I wrote a new preface. And the preface was so self-lacerating, parang sabi ko, bullshit tong librong to, that my publisher said, if you're going to say that, Leloy, bakit pa natin to i-republish? So I think the value of the book now is that you can read it and see yung beginnings of yung critique ng EDSA. Kasi nga, yung first time ko marinig yung word na dilawan pejoratively, 2009, doon sa ano.
Yeah.
So yun. There's one thing I want to say, I think, if I may, kind of in closing, because you mentioned it's so hard to take yourself out of these silos, diba? And the reason why it's so hard to take yourself out of these silos is because mabibreak yung self-esteem mo kung sinabi mong mali ka or mali yung mga kaibigan mo. So, mahirap yon. And the only solution to that is to be strong enough to change your mind and to be strong enough to disagree with friends and family, or to be strong enough to admit na yung kalaban mo may tama. And how do you get to that position of strength? I think you get to that position of strength by looking for anchors in your life, looking for real love in your life. If you feel loved in your life, kung parang fundamentally feel ko mahal ako at may minamahal ako, walang problema if I say nagkamali ako, may tama yung kalaban ko. Walang problema because I'm fundamentally loved. I know that's a very cheesy way of responding to it, but like in this day and age, we need to be strong, and the only way to do that is to remember that, is to find sources of love that will keep our feet on the ground.
No, I think that's a good point, especially because we live in a hyper-connected social media world where a lot of people, whether they want to, whether they're aware of it, parang nakahinge na sa clout yung self-esteem mo minsan, or yung image of self-worth mo na yun nga on social media. It's hard to admit that you were wrong, or that it's time to re-examine the things that you presume to be the absolute truth. Although that opens us up also to disinformation minsan na kung masyado mo namang kina-question yung truth na tinuro sa inyo, na naniniwala ka na sa mga tulad ni Pinoy Monkey Pride. And similar channels, marami na naglipanan ng mga ganun. To conclude, Leloy, para siguro mas masaya naman ng konti, this podcast or this show tries to answer where are we heading, trying to make sense of where we are now and where we're heading. But for you on a personal level, like what do you read, what do you watch, listen to, or do to help you make sense of your world?
So first of all, relaxation is just to watch all the big shows on Disney Plus, from Star Wars, etc. And
wala kaming ganun sa Pilipinas eh.
Meron kayong access, wink wink, meron kayong ganyan sa Pilipinas. Alam natin lahat meron kayong ganyan. But yung reading is, for me, like always read comparatively. Don't just read about the Philippines. I try to read about what's happening elsewhere in the world, and then of course to read where I'm weak. So when I was an undergrad, or when I was early in my academic career, my weakness was economics. So I read a lot of economics, and now it's my current obsession. So read where you think you're weak, because that's always a great challenge. That's what I do.
What's your current read, or is there a book that you're reading right now?
Current read na binabasa ko yung Slow Horses, yung spy novel. I'm reading spy novels. So I think we should read to make ourselves happy also these days.
I used to be so pretentious about not wanting to read romance novels, and then the 2022 campaign happened, and I'm like, read all the romance novels you want.
Nicholas Sparks levels ganyan. Mahilig ako magbasa ng Nicholas Sparks nung high school ako, kasi broken-hearted ako, tapos wala akong ginawa kundi makinig ng side A. Kasi wala akong date so may kinig lang ako side A. So side A has gotten me through a lot. Maybe I should start listening to them.
Napaka-specific ng narrative. And look at you now, you're rooted in love, diba? Yun yung goal natin lahat at the end of the day, is to be rooted in love and to make better sense of the chaos around us. Maraming salamat, Leloy, for indulging us. So this has been Bekopin. This is 36 years. Again, it's a show where we talk about Philippine politics, news, and democracy. Catch 36 years on Rappler's social media pages and other podcasts and shows of Rappler, actually, and on wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening, watching, and we'll see you again next week. Bye.